You hear the words king, majesty, empire, and your mind fills with gold, with marble, with music written for rooms too large for breath. That's how stories are told. That's how history is wrapped, in velvet, in silence, in distance. But history, when listened too closely, doesn't glitter. It groans. It shuffles. It forgets its lines, especially at the end. The final days of a king are rarely part of the official portrait. The oil painting stops before the fever. The biography pauses before the stomach swells, the skin darkens, the voice disappears. We are taught to remember triumph, to remember legacy, but not the room, not the smell, not the flickering of a candle as a monarch breathes slower, then slower still. Peter Burke teaches us to look for the small signs, not the grand declarations, but the way a glove is folded, the way a servant avoids eye contact, the silence after a march that no one attends. These are the traces of a culture revealing itself, not through what it says, but through what it hides. Not through monuments, but through the gaps between marble. A king's death is not always a coronation in reverse. It's often quieter, more awkward, more human than history would like to admit. And that's precisely why it matters. Because in those final moments, in those forgotten beds, in those misplaced coffins, and wrinkled robes, we find something rare. We find the body beneath the title, the man beneath the myth. This is not a tale of scandal, not a parade of royal humiliation. This is a soft listening. A slow walk through moments where the divine touches the ground and forgets to stand back up. A hand once kissed, now cold and unattended. A crown in a drawer gathering dust while the world continues outside. And maybe that's why these stories were silenced. Not because they lack drama, but because they lack distance. They felt too close, too familiar. Because the king, in the end, is not so different from you. He fears the ache in his chest. He dreads being forgotten. He wonders who will stay in the room when his breath grows shallow. So tonight we remember, not the rain, but the resting. Not the scepter, but the soft linen. Not the anthem, but the quiet. And in doing so, we honor something that rarely gets named, the ending that doesn't fit the story, the dignity that falters, the humanity that remains, even beneath the crown, even when the curtains close, even when history forgets to bow. It's a strange thing, isn't it, how even a king can be left waiting. You would think death would come with certainty, with plans, with a marble crypt already measured and polished. But history, again, resists the myth. Some kings, many kings spent. years in places not meant for them. Temporary vaults, forgotten chapels, stone boxes tucked behind altars, waiting for decisions no one wanted to make. The idea of a final resting place feels sacred, eternal. But for many monarchs, that finality was delayed. Politics needed time. Funds ran low. Civil unrest made ceremony impossible. The tomb was ready, but the kingdom wasn't. And so the body waited, sometimes embalmed, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes decaying just slowly enough to remain a symbol. In the cold halls of castles, the smell of hesitation clung to the stone. Courtiers walked past makeshift chapels, pretending not to breathe too deeply. Conversations became whispers. And the question hung in the air like dust in candlelight. When will we bury him? Properly, no one had the answer. Or if they did, it wasn't their place to say it. And what does it mean to delay a burial? To leave a king once surrounded by honor and flame alone in a box made for the meantime, it breaks the rhythm of death. It unsettles the narrative. The king is supposed to lie in glory, not in waiting. But perhaps this, too, is part of the truth. Perhaps the delay speaks more honestly of grief, of discomfort, of the awkwardness of ending something so big, so symbolic, so heavy. In modern times, public mourning is often swift, organized. It ends with applause and headlines. But back then, the weight of tradition slowed everything. And sometimes that weight was too much. The tomb remained empty. The body remained hidden. And the memory remained unsure. There's something haunting about an unfinished funeral, about a king waiting in silence while the world around him forgets the urgency of death. We imagine power ending with trumpets. But sometimes it ends in delay, in stillness, in corridors too, quiet for ceremony. And in those quiet spaces we are, reminded no one, not even a king, escapes the slow, unfinished work of saying goodbye. The idea of embalming is simple. Preserve the king, preserve the image. Keep him whole, keep him holy. A body that defies decay is a body that refuses mortality, that echoes the divine. But between idea and execution, there is often a gap. And sometimes that gap reeks. In dim rooms, behind thick doors, the work of preservation begins. Herbs, oils, linen wraps, prayers whispered into wax. And yet, what happens when the ritual falters? When the herbs are stale? When the incision is careless? When the heat outside makes the skin swell before the ceremony even starts? There are records too many, perhaps, of royal bodies that did not wait patiently for their eternal rest, of kings whose remains bloated, darkened, leaked, whose faces swelled until no portrait could help, of processions paused, not for reverence but for air, of attendants swallowing, nausea behind closed lips. The king, once untouchable, becomes suddenly too much, too present. His body speaks louder than the eulogy, louder than the anthem. And it says, this is what happens. This is what flesh does. No crown stops it. No title delays it. No lineage protects it from the collapse of organs, the breakdown of certainty. In these moments, the king becomes unbearably human, not divine, not eternal, but fragile, failing. And that fragility unsettles the court. What do you do when the symbol of power can no longer be looked at? When the scent of decay overpowers the scent of incense? Some historians describe these failures clinically. Others omit them, but the silence around it poorly. Embalmed king is its own kind of history. A history of discomfort. A history of denial. A history of people turning, not from rebellion, but from the undeniable truth of the body. And still, the embalmed king was displayed, wrapped, perfumed, layered in velvet. The illusion held if, only from a distance. But those who prepared the body, who cleaned the fluids, who sewed the... Seems those people knew. They saw the difference between symbol and skin. They knew the smell of power undone. To embalm badly is not just a technical failure. It is a rupture in the narrative of sovereignty. A moment where the divine pretension of royalty meets the unstoppable honesty of death. And in that rupture, we glimpse something uncomfortable and deeply human. There are deaths so quiet, so unroyal, that they barely ripple the surface of history. Deaths that do not take place in gold-lit chambers, but in barns, in borrowed beds, on the edge of it, border no longer loyal. A king, in the end, is a man. And a man in flight is often just a name in a ledger or a whisper behind a closed door. These are the kings who died without witnesses, without the drum of ceremony, without the incense and the priests, and the velvet drapery of tradition. They died with the window open. They died listening for footsteps. They died hungry, or sick, or afraid. They died without being called. Your Majesty, one last time. And what is a king really when the crown is not near? When the guards have gone, the throne is taken, and the coat of arms is a memory. Etched in nothing but dust? There are stories, quiet, often unconfirmed, of monarchs, buried under assumed names, of bodies discovered months later with no one quite sure if they were royalty or refugee. One was found in a modest cottage, still clutching a small coin he never spent. Another in a monastery, wearing robes that hid the shape of once regal shoulders. They were alone, profoundly. Alone, and yet surrounded by the final democracy of death. What unsettles is not only the fall from grandeur, but the banality of the setting. A cracked teacup. A broken sandal. A threadbare blanket no richer than the ones worn by the villagers outside. These were kings who died without their music, without their history, who vanished into the anonymity they once ruled over. And perhaps the greatest irony is that this quiet dying, this vanishing, was sometimes more feared than death itself. To die in battle, to fall with a sword in hand, was one thing, but to fade, unnoticed, unmarked, as if your name had always been dust, that was the deeper terror. Some were exiled before their final breath, stripped not only of land and power but of story. No chroniclers waited by their side. No poets wrote their laments. Just silence and sometimes the rustling of leaves in a strange wind. History often avoids these moments, not because they are rare, but because they are too honest, too close to what we all fear, the possibility that everything grand can end, not with fire or fanfare, but with a quiet sigh, that the crown can be traded not for glory, but for a little warmth in the cold. And yet, in that very human ending, in that flight, that final breath in an unfamiliar room, lies a kind of truth that thrones rarely admit. A truth about endings that do not ask permission. A truth about power that does not shield from solitude. A truth about kings who, in the end, were only men. There is an assumption that the death of a king guarantees dignity. That every detail, from the velvet of the drapes to the slow rhythm of the drums, will unfold in perfect, solemn harmony. But ceremonies are made by humans, and humans forget, fumble, misplace. Even in death, royalty is not immune to error or to the quiet absurdity that sometimes creeps into rituals built to impress. In one case, a royal procession wandered off course because no one had updated the maps. The mourners marched through unfamiliar streets, past shops that remained open, past children who didn't. No, they were meant to lower their voices. The coffin passed a bakery that filled the air with the smell of warm bread, more comforting than the incense, carried by tired priests. And for a moment, the people watching did not feel awe. They felt confusion. There are records of coffins that arrived late, of carriages that broke down mid-procession, of horses that refused to move, as if protesting the burden of pulling a future myth. There were ceremonies interrupted by rain that soaked the velvet, by wind that scattered the hymn sheets, by crowds too thin to echo grief convincingly. One funeral paused because the key to the crypt had been misplaced. The mourners waited awkwardly under gray skies while a servant ran down a corridor in search of memory. Sometimes the wrong body was placed in the wrong casket. A nameplate engraved in haste. A switch unnoticed until the moment. The lid was opened again years later. Silence followed, a silence filled, not with reverence, but with disbelief. And there were those ceremonies that failed not because of error, but because of indifference. The city didn't stop. The markets didn't close. Bells tolled, but not in every quarter. Some people didn't know a king had died. Some knew and simply didn't care. These weren't rebellions, just lives continuing with their own. Rituals of bread, of debt, of laughter. A quiet refusal to freeze time for someone who, perhaps, had never looked them in the eye. In those moments, the distance between ruler and ruled became visible, not in anger, but in apathy. And when history is written, these awkward moments are often trimmed away. They are too undignified, too mundane. The royal funeral must appear flawless in retrospect. The solemn grandeur must be preserved. The truth, the reign, the broken, real, the missing key is often buried deeper than the king himself. But these failures speak volumes. They remind us that ceremony is fragile, that even the most meticulously scripted farewell can falter, that no amount of gold leaf or trumpet, fanfare can prevent a gust of wind, or a servant's mistake, or the quiet absence of public mourning. In these fractured rituals, there is an honesty that polished history cannot replicate. They show the tension between the symbol and the world it tries to command. And they whisper something strange and tender, that even in their final acts, kings depended on the hands of others. That even in death, power must ask to be remembered, and sometimes it is politely declined. The body of a king does not always remain whole. In some cases, it was never meant to. Divided, preserved, hidden, or displayed, royal remains have often taken paths more complex than the monarchs they once composed. In cathedrals, in reliquaries, beneath unmarked stones, fragments of kings linger, not as bodies, but as symbols fractured across time. A hand in a velvet-lined box. A heart sealed in lead, buried beneath a different church than the one holding the skull, a jawbone past, quietly between collectors. Each piece is a whisper of sovereignty, reduced to matter, matter that could be. Held, worshipped, sold. What begins as reverence often ends as curiosity, and what once bore a crown becomes a puzzle of flesh, of marble, of myth. There are stories of royal heads taken during uprisings paraded through streets, where the crown once inspired fear, of bones mistaken for relics and blessed unknowingly, of coffins reopened generations later, revealing bodies rearranged by accident or by deliberate erasure. Sometimes the body of a king was lost, entirely misfiled in a crypt or reburied, under a name no longer remembered. The division of the royal corpse was not always desecration. It was also devotion. The heart, thought to contain virtue or courage, was kept apart, a sacred organ, offered its own tomb. The hand that signed decrees or gave blessings became a relic to inspire loyalty. But in these rituals there was discomfort, too, the unease of holding too tightly to something meant to return to earth. And still, they kept the pieces. Sometimes out of belief, sometimes out of politics. A kingdom might not possess the crown anymore, but to possess the king's bones. Even a fragment was to claim part of his legitimacy. A church bearing his heart could claim divine favor. A town that protected his finger might imagine itself chosen, however quietly. Over time, these fragments become detached from their stories. The relic remains, but the king it belonged to fades. A toe bone becomes an artifact. A rib becomes a question. What remains of royalty when even its body can be scattered by reverence, by rebellion, by time? In the end, there is something humbling in these scattered remains. They remind us that no body escapes the earth. Not even a king's. That power so carefully constructed can be dismembered, not only politically, but anatomically, that a body, no matter how revered, returns to dust in parts and silence in stages. And yet the fragments endure. Not always understood, not always named, but held nonetheless by glass, by stone, by memory, as if we're still unsure whether to let them go. Michel Foucault once described bodies not simply as biological facts, but as landscapes of meaning, territories, shaped by power, culture, and silence. And few bodies have carried as much symbolic weight as those of kings, not just in life, but especially in death. In death, the royal body shifts from sovereign to sign, from individual to institution, from presence to absence, and this transition, so densely ritualized, so thick with intention, is where the illusion often fractures. What remains of a king after the ceremonies end? After the banners are folded, the candles blown out, the music stopped? Sometimes a statue. Sometimes a name on a building. Sometimes only the story others needed to tell. But the body tells another story. One that cannot be fully erased, no matter how carefully the pages are edited. There is, in every undignified royal death, a kind of intimacy that history resists, a tenderness in the mésanges, a reminder that no crown can protect against decay. That power does not prevent loneliness, that the final breath comes in rooms that smell of illness, on pillows stained by fever, in silence not, always broken by prayers. The end for kings is not exempt from the human. And perhaps that's the point. To look beyond the titles, the robes, the public mourning, and hear something quieter, the sound of a life ending not with grandeur, but with gravity, not with spectacle, but with softness. A life once weighed down by symbols now, reduced to something far more honest, a body that once held fears, memories, contradictions. These stories of misplaced coffins, of rotting embalming, of forgotten funerals, they do not mock the monarchy. They humanize it. They stretch our understanding of legacy beyond marble and gold. They return us to the strange truth that dignity is not inherited, It is not granted by ritual. It is perhaps most visible in what we try to hide. A king who dies alone, unwept by his. People teaches us something about the limits of authority. A funeral that falters shows us how fragile spectacle really is. A decomposing body under too much perfume reveals the hollowness of performance. And the silence in history books, the parts missing, point not to absence, but to fear. Fear of confronting how mortal even the most powerful truly are. But in this confrontation, there is also release. Because if kings are not so different from US, if their deaths are messy, delayed, mismanaged, or ignored, then maybe. The distance we feel from history softens. Maybe we can see the past not as a gallery of untouchables, but as a long procession of people flawed, complex, afraid, resilient. And in that realization, a strange kind of peace emerges. A humility that warms the bones. Because when we stop demanding perfection, from the stories we inherit, we begin to find something deeper. Not glory, but grace. Not myth, but meaning. So let the crown rest. Let the portrait fade. Let the final breath be just that, final. And let us remember the kings not only for how they ruled, but for how they ended. Quietly, imperfectly, humanly, just like everyone else.